You see that, I write in the book about Teddy Roosevelt's rhetoric around race suicide, and that women and men, but there was, I think, a little bit of an emphasis on the women who were abstaining from marriage and not reproducing, and he's very worried about middle class and upper class white women. This is the concern, is that these women, and it's often middle class white women who are not marrying in the late 19th century, who are not reproducing enough, are imperiling the nation because they're not having enough white upper class children. And this is what Teddy Roosevelt was talking about in the early 20th century. It's also when you begin to see the stigmatization of single women in a different way. They're considered perverted. There's a perversion, and frigidity is considered a perversion, and women are considered unwell if they're, I can't remember what the source of this was, if their ovaries are not regularly bathed in semen. And there's also, Stephanie Coontz has written about this, it's the early 20th century when women's relationships with each other as friends in youth begin to be a worrisome relationship. And lesbianism is in the medical community, there's the identification of lesbianism both as an identity and a perversion.
Yeah, and it gets even worse than that. What a lot of people don't know is that from between about 1895 and about 1910, young girls who masturbated were subject to clitoridectomies. Oh. Right? We don't know that history in the United States, but it is true that sexuality among women, pleasurable sexuality, was considered a no-no. So,
and yet in the early 20th century, these are the same years that popular culture starts pushing dating, heterosexual dating, and youthful. I mean, and this coincides with the invention of the automobile, of public venues where people are going, where young people can go on dates. I think it's 1914 or 1916 that the word dating first appears in the Ladies' Home Journal. And the idea of there's a push from many sectors to get these women who are living outside of marriage in, I think, threatening numbers, or at least amongst the privileged, they seem to present a threat to sort of herd them back into marriage. And that's part of why you're saying the marital institution at that point is changing, and it's the beginning of a more companionate relationship based on love, ideally.
Okay, but I'm going to say one more thing about the 19th century, and then we can move into the 20th century. Coverture, does that word mean anything to you? Doesn't mean anything? Raise your hands if the word means. This is fascinating because it is the sort of core of how we think about women's history. The law in the colonial period through most of the 19th century and into the current period, and I'll give you some examples later if you like. The law of coverture it declared that marriage embodied the unity of the husband and wife, and that the two were one under the law, and the husband was that one. What the law of coverture meant was not only that a woman who inherited money from her father and then married passed over her entire inheritance, including real estate, to the husband who controlled it for the entire marriage, could get rid of it if he wanted to and leave her utterly bereft at widowhood. It meant that women had to follow the residence of the husband. If the husband decided he was going to go out west and he wanted to take his wife and kids with him, out west she went in the covered wagon. She had no choice. A woman's religion was her husband's religion. Her nationality followed that of her husband. So an American-born woman who married a foreign citizen assumed the nationality of that foreign citizen. If she could vote when she was unmarried, she could no longer vote if she was not if she married a non-citizen because she was not a citizen. That changed in 1923 as a result of married women, not single women, pushing for change. That law of coverture, which was such a dominant set of laws and customs and habits by the early 20th century, in the 19th century was already beginning to be challenged by married women. And I would argue that for the 19th century, what made independence possible was not that single women were challenging the laws, but it was married women who were saying, hey, I want to keep my own wages when I marry. I don't want to give up my own wages. I want custody over my children. It was men who got automatic custody over children in the 19th century. And so what one might argue, I'd like to know what you think about this, is that married women push to change laws that then make it possible for women to live independently and make a living at it.
Well, I guess my response to that would be I think that it's possible that both things are true simultaneously. I mean, my book was looking specifically at unmarried women, although as I write, it's not as though, and I don't mean to give the impression that everybody in the abolition suffrage movement, I mean, Elizabeth Cady Stanton was very famously married with many children, and I mean, many of the abolitionist suffragists were married. They were taking part in these struggles as well. I was looking at what seemed to me to be true, and I would stand by it, that there was perhaps an overrepresentation in the 19th century in some of those social movements of unmarried women for reasons that make a lot of sense. As I said, they had you disagree with this?
Well, I don't know because I haven't counted.
I know.
But
and it depends on
worthy of a challenge.
But I don't mean to suggest that it was single women alone who were powering these movements. And I would argue that, yes, what you're pointing out about the ways in which married women were challenging laws of coverture is absolutely true. It's 1869 that they start to overturn, I can't remember what it's called, the one that said a woman couldn't testify against her husband in court. What's that particular statute called? That a woman couldn't testify against her husband in court because they were presumed to be the same person.
That actually doesn't get overturned in practice until the 19th.
But in small cases, I think 1869 is the first.
And indeed, it still prevails in law when, that is, a married woman can't testify. A married man can't testify against his wife either, so it's gender neutral now.
Right. So I would say things that you're pointing to are absolutely true, but at the same time, some of the ways in which unmarried women are working within the social movements that are also creating conditions. If you look at the teaching profession, teacher unionism, Margaret Haley, who was a union leader in Chicago, and she was a really crucial labor. I mean, I feel embarrassed now telling a story about Margaret Haley, but
it's a good story.
Teaching was conceived of as a profession that was explicitly for unmarried women. And this was, I mean, again, so many of these things are happening at the same time as all kinds of social and cultural shifts that mean that there are more children in school, literacy rates are going up, there's a demand for more teachers, and there are unmarried women, and this profession is created. But of course, the wages for teachers are very low. It's very difficult to live on them. Margaret Haley, I can't remember the year that she put up a big fight because they're arguing that single women's salaries as teachers should not be lower because women were supporting themselves and often supporting other members of their family, and that as teachers they needed to make a living wage. And she was a person who wound up joining her understanding that there was not a lot of political power in an all-female union, especially in years that they could not vote. She needed to join herself up with the predominantly all-male union, with the Chicago union, and it was sort of the invention, I believe, of modern teacher unionism, which you can see is still an incredibly powerful force politically.
Actually, she joins with the male dominated
Teachers.
teachers' union, and then the women lose power completely, and they don't get anything of what they want until they organize once again in the late 1930s, and then women, and Margaret Haley is still active at that point, so the women begin. But one of the interesting things is that if you were a teacher in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, through most of the 1950s in most American states, and you married, you got fired. Immediately, you got fired. And then in the 50s, that begins to change. So marriage had consequences that led to change. But I wanted actually to ask you another question, and it's a question about family. So, you know, independent women, that connotes, you know, the kind of lifestyle that you describe so beautifully in the book. You know, I can have girlfriends, I can go out every night, I can, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, that's
but
a
there's
very small subset of it.
Surely a question of class there, that many so-called independent women or single women earning a living are supporting children, are supporting aging parents. Up until the post-World War II period, they were also supporting siblings and often putting siblings through school. And talk to your parents and grandparents, and you'll see, you know, who was able to go to school and who wasn't because a daughter was sent out to work while somebody else managed to stay in school. So I sometimes think this word independent woman, single woman, you know, a single woman living with a family, shouldn't we have a different name for her than the single woman who lives in a, you know, a 350 square foot studio?
Yes. I think single is, I mean, this is one of the questions that I've gotten a lot as I've been talking about this book, because I use the word single in the book as a kind of catch-all, because there is no real descriptor for what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is not some binary state where you're either a married woman or you're not a married woman. It's basically the lifting of the early heteromarriage imperative, this one model, this one path down which most women were nudged for centuries. And when you lift that one model, what you get is not just one alternative model that's like sushi and brunch, certainly. What you get, and that's not just true about when you say it's not just sushi and brunch, it's also economic hardship and 42% of single mothers living below the poverty line. You also get, even within class categories, just this infinite variety of paths. And that's the difference. It's not single versus married. That's why I caught myself, and it's fair to talk about the title, that it's just independent women. And in the book, I'm talking about all kinds of independence in different sections of the book. And you know, whether we are talking about economic independence, a kind of sexual independence, a sexually liberated life outside of marriage, becoming a parent independent of a married partnership or a heteromarried partnership. And so there are all kinds of riffs on independence. And you're right that it standing alone is not a particularly useful word to describe what is the alternative to this one script that was on offer to a lot of women for a long time out of economic necessity. You know, that this was the kickoff to adulthood because there was a state of economic dependence on earners, on men. And so the alternative is, you know, can include an infinite variety of relationships, of friendships, of support networks, of you know, levels of earning, wealth, poverty, of types of sexual lives, sexual choices, and many of them may include marriage. Traditional, early, some of, you know, what we talk about now, it's not that nobody's getting married early anymore. It's not that It's just that, as you say, marriage itself is changing, and this is something I write about in the book at length. Marriage itself is changing. The times and circumstances under which we enter into marriage, if we do, are changing. We can now enter into gay marriages, late marriages, brief marriages, wildly untraditional marriages, or not be in marriages for periods. We can have, lengthy monogamous relationships. We can live like nuns. We can live sexually adventurous lives. And we can do lots of these things and still be, and not necessarily be aberrations, which is not to say that there aren't still enormous pressures and punishing messages directed toward women who live outside of marriage.
So what do you think makes it possible? I mean, you started by saying that the numbers of single women increased dramatically in the 90s, the number of women who stay out of marriages. What do you think makes it possible for women to live independently by any of these definitions?
Well, increased, a lot of the directly, consciously political victories of the 1970s. So the legalization of birth control, first for married people and then for single people, the legalization of abortion, all of which are tied up with a sexual revolution in terms of our attitudes about having sex outside of a married context and outside of a procreative context. So that permits a kind of a set of new sexual possibilities.
Invention of the pill?
Yes, certainly tied up in that. Yes, and then the legalization of it. And it's interesting. It is interesting that first it happened for married people and then it happened for single people, which was really an acknowledgement that you can be a full person outside of a marriage. I mean, and it's a very interesting legal decision and worth going back and looking at. Certainly, a lot of the victories around of the women's movement of the 1970s, women being able to enter colleges, more women being able to get higher educations in more kinds of fields, being able to enter more kinds of fields, permits, even though we are not at wage equality, there is still a gender pay gap and much graver racial pay gaps. There are certainly more economic opportunity for women. A lot of the victories, there's also an interesting relationship in terms of how one of the big first impacts of the second wave was on divorce rates. Because when all of these, it wasn't that after the second wave, even though there were some radical feminists who were talking about the disestablishment of marriage and catching a lot of flack for it, and they really were considered, some of the more radical feminists, people like Betty Friedan, were very marriage friendly. What you got was not a wave of women not marrying in the 70s. Women were still marrying. But the expectations for the kinds of lives they could live outside of marriage and also for what the expectations of them within marriage were meant that there were suddenly a lot of marriages that might have been entered into with one set of expectations from an earlier era. And then the expectations of the women within them began to rise with the political shifts and changing attitudes about what might be possible in their lives. And you got a massive divorce wave in the 1970s and the 1980s. And that, I think, had a couple of effects. First of all, you had more unmarried women out there. If they were divorced women, it became increasingly normalized to have women without rings on their fingers, to be unattached from a husband. Secondly, you had a generation of children who were able perhaps to see marriage as an institution of variable quality, which is something. That's a change.
So one of the things that happens as a result of the wave of divorce in the 70s is that women begin to agitate for some of the benefits of marriage, even though they're no longer married. So divorce means that women lose their husbands' pensions. That changes in many states. In the 1970s, they get access to half their husbands' pensions. They get access to their husband's Social Security if they've been married for 20 years or more. Now it's 10 years. they get access to credit in their own names, which is one of the most devastating issues of dependence. You couldn't buy a house because you couldn't, or a car, or a washing machine even, because you couldn't get credit in your own name. But the divorce revolution meant that changed.
Did that all change in 1974? The equal.
Well, it didn't all change in 1974, but it changed between 1973 and 1977.
Right.
So,
the Equal Credit Opportunity Act
was
of 1974. And this is, do you guys know that before that, a married woman could not get a credit card in her own name, let alone a mortgage?
And that wasn't so long ago.
It's 1974.
My first credit cards were in my husband's name, and I'm not all that old yet. So move on a little bit and just see if we can't sort of parse this a little bit. Now I'm worried a little bit about, I'm worried about race, I'm worried about ethnicity, I'm worried about migration and immigration, and thinking that a lot of the kinds of things that we're talking about, including sometimes access to credit or access to husbands' pensions and so on, those are the perquisites of not necessarily affluent women, but relatively affluent women. And on the other hand, we have single women, especially single mothers, who actually are punished for being economically independent, if you like, that is.
Well, or punished from being independent of marriage. You mean poor single women who are punished simply for being
punished for being sexually active.
Yes, for having children outside of marriage. Yes,
exactly. So that this notion of singleness as treated positively by the state or culturally positively actually is something that we need to step back and say that under some circumstances, singleness is not necessarily well treated
in many
custom or culture.
I would say it's only very recently that it's treated at all well in custom or culture, and not always. So in terms of how race figures into this in the United States, it's fascinating because at the end of the 19th century, after emancipation, black marriage rates are higher than white marriage rates. In part, marriage was not legally recognized between slaves. After emancipation, there's the legal recognition of marriage. The marriage rates are higher for a number of reasons for African Americans. These are the same years when middle-class white women, there's this dearth of husbands because so many of them on the East Coast have moved west. Yes?
I just want to interject that marriage rates are higher for significant reasons, partly because the Freedmen's Bureau was quite rigid about not giving pensions to the wives of African American men who'd served in the Union Army unless those wives or widows had been legally married. So the incentive to legally marry in a system which had denied marriage to them was just enormously important. Also, you couldn't get the land you were entitled to, and so on.
Right. Black marriage rates stay higher than white marriage rates through the early part of the 20th century. And then in the early to middle of the 20th century, you see all these kinds of forces, some of which we were touching on earlier, coming from all different directions, sort of encouraging white middle-class marriage, again, as a norm, and the earlier the better. And we all know this, right, from our history about the post-war 1950s, where middle-class white women were encouraged into these suburban homes. And we think of that as the Norman Rockwell period and in fact, marriage rates for white women were sky high, and marriage ages were very low. Women were dropping out of colleges. All the moves that women had made in the late 19th and early 20th century into higher education, those women there were now these colleges where women could go, they were dropping out to marry early. And a lot of what happened after World War II, where the government really participates in supporting the creation of a white middle class, a white patriarchal middle class in which there's a male earner and a woman at home. The government participates in this in all kinds of ways, including by funding the creation of these suburbs, which are all white. They exclude black families. By the building of roads and highways that connect urban centers to these suburbs that are all white, in which black families are barred from living. Those same highways are cutting off black neighborhoods from public transportation and from jobs. The GI Bill, which funds so many white soldiers' entrance into college after World War II, does not do the same thing for returning black servicemen who are often not admitted into these colleges, who often don't have the resources to take the time to go to college. And the Veterans Affairs Administration did not serve returning black servicemen well. So you have this creation of the middle class that is being goosed by the government, and the very same mechanisms that are solidifying this white middle class, in which white middle class women are kind of re-entombed in the home, is cutting off black families from the resources that would make that kind of patriarchal family structure possible. And what you see starting in the 1950s is the black marriage rate begin to fall. Because when you don't have the economic resources, and this is an argument that is ongoing and constant about chicken or egg when it comes to marriage rates and economic resources, my argument is when you, and I'm not alone in it, when you don't have the economic resources to support a marriage, when you don't have enough economic resources, marriage becomes a less plausible and practical option for a lot of people. So black marriage rates really begin to fall, and you see higher divorce rates, higher rates of children out of wedlock. And what you get from, so the same mechanisms are creating these two divergent experiences of family life in the United States in the 1950s. And what you see is in 1963, the feminine mystique, which is the explosion out of those white suburbs, and gets credited with being the kickoff of the feminist movement, although that's kind of a sloppy characterization. And in 1965, you have the Moynihan Report, which looks at black single women and diagnoses them as the center of black poverty and the pathologized center of black poverty. So that's in the contemporary iteration of singlehood, which begins with black marriage rates falling in the 1950s, and those single mothers being treated as aberrant and responsible for the ravages of poverty in the black community, is the beginning of what you're talking about in terms of the divergent treatment. So, that's the first contemporary vision of the single woman, is the black mother in the Moynihan Report. You will recognize her, 10 years later, a little later than that, as the welfare queen, and as central to Bill Clinton's argument about welfare reform in the 1990s. So the treatment of black single motherhood in particular, and black female singleness, has been very different from the Sex and the City version of single life that we also get in the late 1990s.
One of the, I think that's wonderful that you sort of laid that out. But one of the things that has always struck me is that just at the very moment when we're attacking poor families, black families for having too many children, black single mothers, we're sending them out to work, white professional women are beginning to have children out of wedlock and without benefit of marriage. Yeah. And those two trends actually cross each other in some way. So there's a decline in the numbers of teenage mothers, for example, and a dramatic increase in the number of independent single women who are starting their own families, either through adoption or through other methods.
Right.
So, but that leads me to the last question I want to ask before we open up to people who I think would like to ask some questions. So here we are in the year 2016, and some of us haven't listen to Beyonce at all. Don't know her lyrics. And I'm thinking about defining singleness, and that our current definitions of Sex and the City define our sense of what singleness is all about. And they incorporate a sense of autonomy, a sense of possibility especially for young women and women who choose not to marry. And that sense of autonomy is new. I mean, it was not possible. So assuming that the lifestyles and the feelings that you describe are as they are, in the outside world, would you say that this could have been possible 50 years ago or 30 years ago even, or that it has become possible only because the kind of work that, there's a much greater equality of work and even of wages, even though they're still unequal. They're much better than the 60 cents to $1 that prevailed when I entered the labor force. There's a much greater sense of equality within the family where, male and female partners and same-sex partners of both sexes take care of families in the same numbers. In other words, that marriage no longer has the same whatever sort of grasp on our consciousnesses that it used to have, and grasp on the economic realities of our lives.
And would that have been possible 50 or 60 years ago? No. I don't think that the kind of independence or variety of female life was available in the good. I mean, so part of what you're talking about is, again, privilege and the Sex and the City celebration of this kind of, and it's not just Sex and the City, which is now it's girls and it's Shondaland and it's Mindy Kaling and it's television. Popular culture is always going to make things a lot glossier, and at least we're seeing more stories of women living a more varied set of lives, but there's still a very narrow slice. You're not seeing a lot of, popular culture that is particularly honest or transparent about economic challenge, much less poverty. But I do think that, I think that what we're looking at is the culmination of a whole series of social and political shifts that are working in tandem in interconnected ways to create new possibilities. And even when when it comes to talking about social policy, one of the things I write about women in politics, and I have spent some time on the campaign trail in the past few days. And yesterday I was listening to Hillary Clinton talk about subsidized childcare, which in my memory 10 years ago was sort of the stuff of second wave feminist fever dreams. And that's exactly the kind of stuff that was vilified and thought of as radical third rail feminazi stuff, really, 10 or 15 years ago. And those kinds of social policies, whether we're talking about paid family leave, higher minimum wage, 2/3 of minimum wage workers are women, half of them are single women, many of them mothers. Again, 42% of single mothers live below the poverty line. Raising the minimum wage would have a powerful effect, would disproportionately benefit women and single women. Paid leave, subsidized childcare. These are the kinds of policies that were considered really left not long ago. And a decade ago. And we're talking about them now. Now, we're talking about them now. That does not mean we're going to see them enacted. But the fact that they are in the reasonable realm of possibility, that they're being presented by the Democratic candidate, who many of us are regularly told is basically center-right, is extremely startling. So I think what you're seeing is you see this process of normalizing. For me, again, it's less about single versus married. I use those words in part out of necessity in the book, but about recognizing women as full humans who have lives that include a variety of commitments, relationships, responsibilities, economic, social, familial, that may or may not those lives may or may not include what we think of as traditional hetero marriage at some point or not at all. But it's basically as recognizing women as full citizens, which has been a very, very long, twisting path in this country, and we're still pretty far from it. But we're getting closer in lots of ways when it comes to the sort of glossy pop culture representations, and also slowly when it comes to the kinds of social policy that would actually support women who are unmarried. One of the things, and if people are interested in talking about the policy and the social policy, we can talk about the fact that there is this Republican dogma that these kinds of policies, subsidizing childcare, paid leave, is women subbing in the government where husbands used to stand, But the government has supported husbands through everything, tax breaks and housing subsidies and funding the infrastructure that makes their businesses possible throughout America, enfranchising them and protecting their enfranchisement from the start if they were talking about white husbands. The government has done all kinds of things to support men throughout the history of the United States.
My favorite is the joint income tax return, which everybody does and takes for granted, which benefits those with disparate income. So if there are two of you and one makes much more than the other, you benefit.
Right.
But if you make about the same amount, then both of you pay more taxes.
Mm-hmm. Right, exactly. But this is the social policy is slowly coming around to basically supporting women and the variety of lives they may lead more dependably than they ever have before. So I think we're seeing things change slowly but steadily on all kinds of fronts.
So on that optimistic note, let's open up to questions from the audience.
Yes.
So I have a question about shopping. Oh, I'm sorry. I guess I have a question about shopping your book around, not shopping just in general. I guess that was a bad segue to start. So I work for a criminal justice nonprofit that focuses specifically on women, and it's really hard to get media attention because you so often see that through the lens of the male. And so I was wondering what it was like to go to publishers and say, I have a book about single ladies, and trust me, you want to fund it, knowing that possibly half the population might not buy it. So.
Well, in part, when it comes to books, you're in luck because women buy books. So publishers, even though there are all kinds of disparities between how women's books are marketed and how they're covered and how they're reviewed, and there are all kinds of studies on that, publishers aren't averse to publishing books that women are going to buy because women are book buyers. It's also a slightly different thing for me because this is what I write about. So, I mean, they already knew I was going to be writing something about women. I would say to you that the thing to do is go to feminist media. When I started as a journalist, there were feminists in the academy. Katha Pollitt was writing, Ellen Goodman was writing, Bell Hooks was writing, but there was not the kind of robust feminist media that there is today, thanks in part to social media, the blogosphere, the expansion of media. What there is now is a variety of publications that are interested in stories about women, and especially stories, well, not especially, but many of them, some of them stories about economic and criminal inequality. And we can talk about it later. My husband's a public defender and we've talked a lot about that in publications that are interested in these issues. And so come after, we can talk about it. Okay.
Hi. My question is about, you talked a little bit about the experience of Black single women as opposed to white single women, et cetera. And I was really struck by how you talked about how it's not singlehood versus marriedom, but like a plethora of experience. And recently we saw Donna Edwards in Maryland lose to Chris Van Hollen, and I just found it to be a very fascinating race. I'm deeply entrenched in politics, but thank you. But I found it to be incredibly fascinating, her campaign, because she is a single woman, and her story is very centered around the fact that she's a single mom, a Black single mom. So I just wondered, like, what is your comment on that and that campaign? Yeah. And it went so negative.
Do people hear about the Chris Van Hollen, Donna Edwards campaign for the Senate, in the Democratic primary to replace Barbara Mikulski as Maryland senator? It was a very, there was a campaign between, Barbara Mikulski is retiring after, I think, 40 years in the Senate. And she has one of the very few Senate seats held by a woman. And it's no accident that both she and Barbara Boxer were retiring this year when they were anticipating that there was going to be a woman at the top of the Democratic ticket, and that it might be a tide that helped preserve women in their seats. And so in the Maryland race, the first person who jumped in was an excellent left-leaning, reliably left white guy named Chris Van Hollen. He's an excellent Democrat. He's the kind of guy, if you're a Democrat, and I assume a lot of people in this room are, you'd like to have representing you. And he was the first guy to jump in, although the day that Mikulski retired, I was told that Donna Edwards wanted to run. It was not a secret that Donna Edwards wanted to run. Donna Edwards is also a terrific Democrat, a really strong, tough, smart, cool, brilliant woman. She is a Black single mother. And she and Van Hollen had one of the ugliest primary races to see who will be the Democratic nominee for this Senate seat that Barbara Mikulski is vacating. And my feminist left friends were totally divided. I mean, and there was a lot of acrimony because Emily's List, which is the organization, the PAC that's devoted to supporting pro-choice Democratic women in politics, and in fact has probably done more to change the structural inequalities of funding that women face before they even get into campaigning for politics. Emily's List very strongly funded Donna Edwards. The Van Hollen campaign was very upset about that and accused her of benefiting from all of this privilege of having Emily's List support her. Van Hollen won. It was very close, and at the end it got very ugly, and Van Hollen won. And many of the people I know are devastated about this. So that's the story of the Donna Edwards Chris Van Hollen race. And Donna Edwards is a fascinating politician. It used to be that there were sort of two. There were very few women in federal politics, and also in many cases in state and local politics. And those who were there often, not always, but often fit one of two models. Either they were never married, which is the Barbara Mikulski model, the lifetime single woman whose political participation was never in question, because what else was she doing with her life? Of course she could devote her life to politics. And widows also fit this. So Margaret Chase Smith from Maine was the widow's mandate put, which is, when a sitting politician died, his wife often took his seat. And then in many cases, it's interesting, and this history very much applies whenever people talk about, it's terrible that the first woman president might be the wife of a former. It's like, well, that's actually our historical model for how women became the first. And often very much more directly through the widow's mandate. And then there were, even in our recent past, somebody like Hillary Clinton or Nancy Pelosi, women who started their own independent political careers only after their kids were grown. Ann Richards in Texas is also an example of this. Because there wasn't the question about what are you doing out on a campaign trail when you have little kids at home, a question that is obviously never asked of male politicians. So it's only really recently in politics that you're beginning to see women with young children, Kirsten Gillibrand. You're beginning to see women who... Sarah Palin. Yeah, there are a number of Republican women who fit this model. You're beginning to see single women. I mean, Gwen Moore was also a single mother. Kamala Harris, who's running for Barbara Boxer's, she is married, but she got married in her 40s for the first time. She's childless. Donna Edwards was a great example. Stacey Abrams, a great politician in Georgia, who I think might someday be president. I love Stacey Abrams. You see a lot of women. Tammy Duckworth, who had a baby while in office. You see many more women of various ages and various family structures and various marital status entering politics. And it's helping to diversify the pool of women who can participate because it was really limiting. I mean, Nancy Pelosi went off. You guys should look it up. It was terrific. A few years ago, when there was this question about whether she was going to continue to lead the party, and Luke Russert, the son of Tim Russert, and he's a young man, a reporter on MSNBC, said, basically, don't you think you should step aside and give somebody else a turn? And you guys should look it up because it's a pretty great moment. Nancy Pelosi really says, look, these guys have 15 years on me because I was home, and you're never asking Denny Hastert, you're never asking Steny Hoyer, you're never asking these old white guys why they don't step aside. Anyway, I don't know if that answers your question, but I think you do see the impact of, basically it's being able to conceive of a greater variety of women, in a greater variety of stages of their lives as being legitimate candidates for anything.
Can I just say one more?
Yeah.
I think what was the most interesting comment, I had a lot of friends who were working on both sides of the race, and I had a friend who I work with say to me, a lot of people have criticized Donna Edwards as being an ineffective legislator.
Right.
And I wonder if the symbolic, history of that seat being held by a single woman, of keeping a woman in the Senate, precedes that, or is a bit greater than that.
So I think the way to think about this, it is possible that that's the case, but the way to think about this is that this is the first time, this beginning about a decade ago, that one can imagine women not being defined by their life stage or their life. So we have never asked of men whether they are bachelors or married or fathers or not. And we are now at the point where, even though people still do ask it, we as women, as feminists, now believe that it's inappropriate to ask what's the life stage of a woman. We believe we should be treated as citizens, as people, not as mothers or wives or daughters or whatever, or single or married for that matter. I still remember the struggle over the word Ms., M.S., when the New York Times actually, for about 3 years after it was in general use, refused to adopt the word Ms. They wanted Mrs. or Miss. Now, of course, we've gone beyond that.
You mentioned the linguistic limitations, about writing about women, and that's something that feminist theory has dealt with over the years, second wave feminism in particular. And I'm wondering if you see anyone addressing that today, because I don't necessarily as much as in previous movements of feminism.
You mean the actual words we use to refer to women? Well, I see it happening a lot because there's so many new words to refer to different gender identities. So they and maybe this is not what you're asking about, but not using gendered pronouns, right. Which I feel like that's a big leap. But is that different from what you're talking about?
I think that's a really good point. I was more talking about within about, and maybe it's because we're beyond that and we're in such a time of like so much feminist media, but I'm wondering how helpful you think that like the pervasiveness of that feminist media is linguistically.
Do you want to?
Yeah, so I can tell you from my 50-year history of being involved in feminism in the United States that the linguistic question has always been a subject for debate and not one that perfectly good feminists of various perspectives can agree on. So there was a long period, for example, when it was incorrect to refer to women, W-O-M-E-N. It was women with a Y, as though that would get around it. And now, of course, the discussion of, in a transgendered world, it's probably incorrect to talk about women or men at all, but we should be. And so I think that just goes with the territory that as we move forward, we make changes. We've made dramatic changes, for example, in the use of the he, him, her pronoun. We now find ways when we're writing to just write around that so we don't always assume a male subject. We now assume that the subject can be gender neutral. But I think that's just one of those process things. If you look at the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary, 50 years from now, you'll see the transformation there.
And I do, what Alice talks about in terms of the discussion around do you use the word women with regard, say, specifically to reproductive rights is one of the biggest fights that I've heard my feminist contemporaries. I mean, there are, I can't, there, an abortion, several abortion funds have stopped using the word women. I just got a book yesterday from the Feminist Press. It's, radical care for pregnant people, because there's a real serious political move to stop talking about pregnancy and reproductive rights as a women's issue and rather as a people's issue. But then there's the pushback to that, which is, and you see that also happening around the language at women's colleges. Do you remove the language of sisterhood? Because it excludes trans women and trans men. And then that provokes a very passionate response, which is then you're taking this hard-fought language out of the spaces in which it was made safe to use, and you're taking away these linguistic victories in being able to center politics and social movements and reproductive rights around women. And I don't think there's an easy answer. But so that's where I see it happening. And I think that in terms of feminist media, again, one of the things that's happened with the democratization of media is that it has moved away in a lot of ways from scholarship. So that feminist media in the 1970s was very scholarly. It was often long form. It was often coming out of the academy or adjacent to the academy.
Often incomprehensible.
Yes, it was often very jargon-laden. But now what you have, and in part this is because of the economic models of the media, which are falling out, are people who are feminist writers often are made to post 20 items a day, or, more likely 5 or 6, and every day. And it certainly takes away some of the ability to have some really thorny fights about things like linguistics.
So I'm thinking about the Tenement, and I'm thinking about all the women who work there who were so, regardless, there's a woman, Natalie Gumpertz, who woke up one morning in October as a married woman with 4 children, and that night, her husband didn't come home. So overnight, she becomes a married woman with 4 children to a woman who has to not only take care of the whole house, but figure out a way to earn a living. And it's a great story. I invite you all to come hear about it and find out what happens. But there was all of these women had children to deal with, whether they were working or whether they were not, whether they were earning wages or not. And I'm fast forwarding to my own college career, starting college in 1991 and reading, and the Anita Hill thing is happening in the fall. I'm in a feminist political theory class reading Shulamit Firestone's The Dialectic of Sex, which is saying, right, that if the only real way to solve everything is to make sure that women are not in charge of reproduction anymore. And the very drastic measures and radical measures at changing it. But it was hard to read that book and not say, wow, that kind of is the only answer to change things so radically. And I guess my question is, if given, to take this from the Tenement to the White House, which you're working, you're traveling and you're reporting on Hillary Clinton, she becomes president, she makes you in charge of something. What is the one? It's all fun. This is Imagination Station right now. And I'll ask it both to you and to Alice. If there could be one thing, and I know the answers to all of this is many, many more, but what might be the single most important thing that would be important for women, whether single or married, whether they're black or white, all of it?
A policy? One policy?
Yeah. I'll give you two.
Can I do three?
Okay.
Raising the minimum wage, paid family leave, and subsidized childcare.
Alice?
Oh, no. Reversing Hyde. Reversing Hyde comes maybe after raising wages, because that is such a contributor to economic inequality.
Wow. And I'd say the most important thing would be an attack on occupational segregation, the sex segregation of the labor force, which, despite the fact that we like to think that it's gone, is still very present. And it is the source. It is occupational segregation, that is, that women will still work. The majority of women still work in women's jobs, and the majority of men still work in men's jobs. And that's the source of the wage differentials. I think that's one thing I would do, but the second thing, and I don't know how one does this in terms of policy, but I think we have to think about the family in new and reconstructive ways. I think we have to redefine the family. We have to change our minds about what constitutes a family. And then we have to shift I know this is impossible, but we have to shift government, the tax codes, the tax system, the methods of understanding how people relate to each other so that we give space to varieties of human relationships.
I also wanted to just mention something about some of the contradictions of single motherhood and the idea of liberation, because the story you told, this is a reality still for millions of women who have children, perhaps within a marriage, perhaps within a relationship, and then that relationship ends and they are left with the responsibility. There are many lenses through which the ability, the freedom to not have to stay in a bad marriage because you had to be with the partner, because you were economically dependent on him, because you couldn't leave. There was neither economic nor social space for you to be outside of this bad marriage. It is liberating by many measures that is no longer the case. It is also liberating that women no longer, if they want to have children, that they can do it on their own without being socially punished, that it is increasingly possible for them to avail themselves of all kinds of reproductive technology and also increasing acceptance of single parenthood and have children without having to enter a subpar union with somebody just so you get married in time so you can have the children. Those are all liberating. But what is also true is that in many ways those possibilities reinscribe parenthood as a female concern, and that this is not without cost and consideration. And this is something that in the book, Gloria Steinem talks about, that there are all kinds of ways in which increased acceptance of single motherhood is wonderful for women. And there are all kinds of ways in which it exacerbates assumptions about who does the parenting in our culture and who is most closely associated with parenthood. And it reaffirms women as being those figures in ways that aren't necessarily uniformly positive.
Well, I think what I'd like to do is ensure that everything that came from your lips tonight, both of you, goes to the future president's ears. And that we see a president and we see an administration that cares about this policy and takes the time to learn and delve into the intricacies of the history that I think came out tonight. And I want to thank Alice and I want to thank Rebecca, and I want to thank all of you. Both of their books are available for sale here at the museum, and they'll be happy to sign them. And thank you all for coming out tonight and making this such a wonderful occasion. So thank you. Thank you.